So ministry is a wonderful calling, but it is a tough occupation. I was asked to be on a panel discussion at Southern Baptist Seminary, and I was on a panel with two professors from the seminary, and there was a bunch of preachers. We all made statements, and at the end, we had question and answers. And the very first question that was asked was, what should a preacher do if a transgender wants to be baptized? I gulped because I didn't have a clue how to answer that question. I'd been retired for a decade, and I thought, what am I going to say? Well, fortunately, these two professors had recently done an extended study on that subject. One had written a paper on it, and they went on and on for 10 or 12 minutes about if this, if that. They gave very thorough answers, and it came time for me to say something, and I said, you know what I think? I think I retired just on time, because 10 years ago, before I retired, we weren't dealing with that kind of subject. And you guys active in ministry now are dealing with questions and issues that were not at all discussed or faced 20 years ago. Gender identity, gay marriage, critical race theory, women's role in the church, all this political hostility that exists in our culture filters over into the church, and if you lean one way or another, you're going to be under attack. So you're expected to lead the church into unfamiliar territory, coping with situations that you were never trained for. And ministry is a wonderful calling, but it is a difficult occupation, and it's becoming more difficult by the year. So my prayer for you would be Paul's prayer for the Ephesians. In Ephesians, the 3rd chapter, here's what he said. For this reason I kneel before the Father, verse 14, from whom his whole family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the saints, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. That you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. That would be my prayer for you, that you would have such a strong heart, such a fullness of the Spirit, that regardless of these pressures that come on you, you'd be able to withstand. I don't know what background all of you come from, but there is in our movement, Christian church, a crisis of discouragement. I served several years ago on the board of the Center for Church Leadership, was based out of Cincinnati. And we were given a $1 million grant from the Eli Lilly Foundation in Indianapolis to do a survey to determine why there's such a high attrition rate in ministry. Why are so many dropping out? The Christian church over the last 3 or 4 decades has experienced considerable growth at a time when most denominations are floundering. So we're in a good period, but at the same time that we're growing numerically in local churches, we're having fewer and fewer young people enter ministry. We've closed down almost half of our Bible colleges. And you go to our primary colleges, Kentucky Christian or Great Lakes Bible College or Johnson Bible College, you ask, how many of you kids going into ministry? Very few. How many going into preaching ministry? Even fewer. So unless we find some way to recruit and to train and to retain the ministers that we have, we're going to face a tremendous crisis in the near future. So we did this survey. We discovered that 70% of the young people who enter ministry quit in the first 10 years. 70%. we discovered that 43% of the people who stayed in ministry for more than 10 years seriously considered dropping out at one point or another. Now, obviously, some drop out because they have a moral scandal. And boy, we've hearing a lot about the high-profile ministers dropping out, being kicked out because of a moral scandal. Some drop out because they really were not fully committed to begin with. I don't think that's the case most times. But after analyzing that survey and interacting with so many preachers, after I retired 18 years ago, I do mentoring retreats for preachers. I do 8 retreats a year. I bring in 8 guys. We spend 3.5 days. Troy came to one of those retreats. There's a lot of interaction. I've done 129 of these retreats with preachers. If you'd have told me when I retired I'd do that many retreats, I never believed it. But it's kind of a sweet spot. So I've interacted with preachers a lot. And after analyzing the survey, talking with these preachers, I've condensed the primary reasons for discouragement in ministry, high attrition rate, as follows. I've got 6 of them. They're in no particular order. Here are the reasons we get discouraged. One is financial stress. Ministers in larger churches are paid much better than the average preacher a few decades ago. Some of you would be shocked to know what mega church preachers get paid. We get paid way beyond what we ever imagined. That's not wrong in itself because it's a high pressure job. What we do with that money is what the issue is. Many, however, in smaller and medium-sized congregations are still barely able to get by, and finances are tight. We discovered in our survey that 54% of the ministers surveyed in the Christian church have no health care benefits, no retirement benefits. Over half of our preachers have to pay for their own health care. And they're living under this pressure. What am I going to do in retirement? Because I can barely scrape to go. They didn't go into ministry to get rich, but to daily face that pressure, and many times the wives have to work, it is a discouraging factor. Second reason is time pressure. Now, in my thinking, it takes between 12 and 20 hours to prepare a meaningful sermon. And the bar is higher today than it's ever been. But that's just the beginning. There are committee meetings to attend and Bible lessons to teach and sick people to visit, staff members sometimes to oversee, future programs to plan, community events to attend, marriage problems to counsel, articles to write, worship services to plan, emails to answer, funerals, weddings, baptisms to perform. Maybe you're down like I was in the first church that I served. My wife and I cleaned the baptismal robes and did a lot of different things. And when we go home at the end of the day, there's always a sense of, I'm not finished. I'm way behind. And as a result, our most important ministry, which is ministering to our own family, sometimes gets neglected. And we feel guilty about not spending more time with our kids and our wives. One of the questions I'm asked in question and answer sessions, and by the way, I'm going to do 2 sessions and you'll be questions and answers. So if you have questions, write them down. I'll try to field them at the end. But one of the questions I'm always asked is, how in the world did you balance family and ministry? Time pressure. Third reason is a gnawing sense of failure. We begin ministry with high expectations of leading a healthy, growing church. We're going to make a difference in people's lives, but it's not long before most of us are disappointed. Not very many people are responding to the invitation to accept Christ as Savior. Attendance hits a plateau. Offerings aren't meeting budget. Church officers are having an affair. The kids are getting into drugs, and people are bickering with one another. Only a handful volunteer to serve in critical areas of church. And we watch Stephen Furtick on TV preach, and he says something, and people stand up and they're applauding. We say the same thing, and people sit there with their arms crossed. You know. There are two things that will discourage you in ministry every time. One is unrealistic expectations, That'll discourage you in a marriage, you know. "Oh, I think my marriage is going to be a big honeymoon, man." Then pretty soon they're saying, "I thought she'd get up at 6:30 in the morning and cook breakfast for me. My wife always did. My mother always did for my dad. It was the 6-month anniversary of our first date, and he forgot about it." You know, if you got unrealistic expectations in marriage, it's going to destroy you. The same thing in ministry. One of the reasons I was able to last in ministry, I grew up in bad churches, and I heard some bad preaching. And why I wound up in ministry, I don't know. But my expectation level was, my goal in life was maybe to go back to Erie, Pennsylvania, and hopefully build a church to 200 people. So the things that happened to me were so far beyond my expectations were low. The second thing that'll really hurt you in ministry is unfair comparisons. You compare yourself with Stephen Furtick or some other church down the street that's having greater numbers, and you can get really, really discouraged. There's this feeling of inadequacy, not measuring up. People try to, if they do it down there, why can't? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how well you do. There's always somebody who does it better. And pretty soon you're getting discouraged because of unfair comparisons. The Bible says when they compare themselves with themselves, they're not wise. You mentioned a book, When God Builds a Church. I wrote that book shortly before I retired, and it did fairly well in Christian circles. But the problem with that book, it was written about the same time another book came out called The Purpose-Driven Church. I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote that, but I saw a headline in USA Today one day that read, "Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Church sells 6 million copies." I thought, 6 million copies? If he gets $1 a book, that's $6 million. Our church is just as big as Saddleback. My book is half as good. Lord, I'd take $3 million. And then I realized, that is so silly. I mean, God had blessed my ministry so far beyond what I ever imagined. But here I am, all of a sudden discouraged because I'm comparing myself with somebody whose book sold more. And when the Bible says they compare themselves with themselves, they're not wise. And if you compare in ministry, you can get discouraged pretty fast. The fourth reason is leadership dysfunction. One of the vexing problems of ministry is the failure of the church's lay leaders to step up to the plate and become effective shepherds. Now, to be fair, we put people in these roles of leadership voluntarily in the church, and we almost give them no training. And their understanding of what is expected of them is pretty low. So most church members, board members, elders, and deacons see themselves primarily as evaluators rather than encouragers. And church board meetings consist of negative criticism, overanalyzing small expenditures, meaningless speculation. And we walk out of there saying, what did we accomplish? There's very little vision casting, problem solving. Shepherds aren't focused on feeding and nurturing and protecting the flock. Instead of being like Aaron and Hur holding up the minister's hand, we feel like our church leaders are sometimes trying to pull us down. I had a retreat for guys from the A Cappella Church of Christ. And anybody from A Cappella Church of Christ in here? They have a vision of the minister as a hired hand. And they're the boss. And one of the guys said, in our church, it's the preacher's job to cast the vision and the elder's job to stop him. And sometimes we get that impression regardless. The fifth reason I would list would be inexplicable loneliness. Although a minister is surrounded by people every day, there are very few who really understand the constant pressure of having that term paper due every week, while at the same time striving to be a personal chaplain to scores of people. And the ministry is an emotional roller coaster. I mean, you can be rejoicing with somebody at the birth of their baby 1 hour and then weeping with somebody who's lost a loved one the next hour. And no one but a preacher can relate to that experience. I find sometimes my wife, we've been married for 59 years. She believes the first 58 are the hardest, but we've been married for 59 years. And there sometimes she doesn't fully understand the pressures that I feel. And this problem is compounded by the fact that there's so little interaction with other preachers. There can be a preacher 2 miles down the road, you share many of the same beliefs, but you never get together because you see each other as competitors where you ought to be encouraging each other. And when I'm talking about the discouragement of preachers, maybe that's not you, but you need to be sensitive to other people, other ministers in the area who may look to you as a more experienced person, and just a phone call or just an email or just having lunch with them would lift them up and maybe keep them going. But that discourages, that loneliness. Then the last one I've got listed I would put as probably number one, and that is constant criticism. Now, to be fair, we probably get more positive comments than preachers used to. People are kind. Matt Proctor said he preached poorly one Sunday. He knew he'd preached poorly, but people still came out and said, good sermon, good sermon. One older lady came out and she was more honest. She said, nice try. Most people aren't that brutal. But I think we get more criticism as preachers today than preachers of a previous generation. People are trained to be critical in our generation. They turn on the radio and listen to sports radio talk shows, and they're just criticizing the coach, and let's get John Calipari out of here. Or you pick up the newspaper and there's an editorial page criticizing the politicians. They go to, you got evaluation forms and performance reviews. People are just trained, and if they're not critical, they feel like they're being shallow. Then you add that to social media. And people, it used to be, if they wanted to write a critical letter, they would make it formal, and by the time they finish it up and polish it up, they'd calm down a little bit and it wouldn't be so harsh. But now, in their anger, they pound out 3 or 4 sentences on the computer and push a button, and it's on your desk in a fraction of a second, and we get more criticism. And I don't care how long you have been in your position, if you're in church, criticism hurts. It's very few people who can say they're not bothered by criticism. Now, I'm in a position I get criticized every day, but I still don't like it. You do get to the place where you can handle it, but criticism hurts. I've got a brother who's in ministry, and he does, I mentioned this last night, he does interim ministries now that he's retired, and he texted me on Sunday afternoon several months back. I can tell you the text almost verbatim. All I said was, God's plan for marriage is one man for one woman for one lifetime. That means that cohabitation, adultery, and homosexuality are outside the will of God. Amen. An angry family met me at the door, and they said, we're never coming back. It's just that kind of hate speech that caused our son to commit suicide. Why can't you just love everybody? One word. Homosexuality. I'm telling you, 50 years ago, that would have never happened. But people are so volatile today, so filled with anger, so programmed by our culture, even sitting in the seats of the church. You can proclaim the truth, you can proclaim it as lovingly as you possibly can proclaim it, and there's still going to be somebody who criticizes. Now let me ask you a question. Why did my brother text me on Sunday afternoon? What's that?
It hurt.
It hurt him. He'd been preaching for almost 45 years and it still hurt. But why did he text me?
You've been hurt.
I understood. Yeah. It hurt. I've been hurt. And I could commiserate with him and I can get as mad about it as he did, and somehow he felt better. But if you don't, there's some occupations, that you got to live with criticism. If you're going to referee basketball, you're going to get a little criticism. You're going to run for political office, you're going to get criticism. You're going to coach a team, and you got to accept the fact, if you're in some position on staff of a church or in a church, people have strong opinions and we're dealing with the eternal matters and it's important to them, and they're sometimes going to criticize and sometimes do so unjustly. So these are the reasons people get criticized. People get discouraged. Now, I think the cause of the defection that people give up and throw up their hands and say, that's it, I'm out of here, is what I would say the erosion of the inner man, or the draining of the Holy Spirit, or the draining of the heart. How many times in the Bible it emphasizes the heart? Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Guard your heart. It is the wellspring of life. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. The passage that I read in Ephesians says, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. The reason we get so down in ministry that we consider quitting is not necessarily the criticism or the comparisons or the wounded pride. I just think there's a gradual erosion of the heart, a gradual erosion and draining of the spirit that leaves us empty without strength to continue. I got an email from a guy who had been through my mentoring program years ago. I'm going to read a paragraph to you. Bob, I'm really struggling right now with an issue I've heard you speak about several times. I'm feeling stretched way too thin in my ministry, and I'm getting to the point that I'm not doing anything very well. I'm not struggling with any kind of sin or immorality. I'm dealing with feelings of inadequacy and depression. I'm just drained. My personal walk with Christ seems nearly non-existent. I need to refocus. As the church has grown, I've become bogged down in administration. I'm horrible at administration. My gifts are preaching and teaching, and I know that's where I need to refocus. And secondly, to begin investing again in people's lives. I think this is what happens to us. We just get drained. You know, we pour out, and we just get drained. I've got two Coke cans up here today. Large Coke cans. That's the only kind the service station had. And I'm telling you, one of these cans is completely full and the other is empty. Now you cannot tell by looking at these cans which is full and which is empty. And I'm telling you, this is us standing before our youth group, standing before our children's department, standing before people preaching. They assume that we are filled with the Holy Spirit. I heard a guy say that a preacher ought to be like a full cup, that wherever he goes, he just kind of splashes on everybody. I got to admit, there are times I'm leaning way over trying to have anything to bless anybody. There are times you're empty and you're just struggling to pour out. People's perception of you spiritually is not the same as who you really are down inside a lot of times. I read in one of Ken Boa's books, Conform to His Image, that Charlie Chaplin, the silent screen comedian years ago, was in Morocco, and he saw in the newspaper that they were having a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest. And so he entered it anonymously, and he came in third. I love that story. People's perception of who you are and who you really are down inside are two different things. I can show you which of these cans is full and which is empty very easy. I squeeze this as hard as I can squeeze it. I can't make a dent in it. Take this one, and just a little bit of pressure, and it collapses because there's nothing inside. Now, we've all seen preachers, church leaders who collapse, and it seems to be really sudden. I was on a platform years ago with Ted Haggard, who was head of the American Family Association, and he preached a sermon on holiness. You felt like you needed to take your shoes off. And 2 or 3 weeks later, he's accused and found guilty of being in a homosexual massage parlor or something. His ministry collapsed. Say, man, that happened suddenly. No, A.W. Tozer said, no man suddenly goes base. There's a gradual erosion of the inner man. Then when the temptation comes or the pressures come and people break, we say that was sudden, but there's this gradual erosion of the inner man. We just punctured a hole in the bottom, drained out the contents. Now, you need to know yourself well enough to know what drains you. We're not all built the same. Sin certainly will drain the spirit from our lives. The bigger the sin, the faster the drain. But that's not all that drains us. Suffering, stress will drain. You got stress at home, child that's rebelling, or your wife has physical problems, or you have physical problems. That'll drain the spirit from your life. But what we don't understand, I don't think most of us in ministry understand, service drains us. If all you do is serve and serve and serve, you may enjoy it, but eventually you get burned out. You're drained. Jesus said, "Who touched me?" He said, "Well, a lot of people touched you." No, I felt what? Power go out from me. If serving people could drain Jesus, or he felt the power go out, how much more so in our lives? Ken Boa has a quote. I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but he talks about external action should derive from internal reality. And this requires a rhythm of solitude and engagement. And he points out that Jesus often withdrew from the crowds that he could be alone with the Father. And if Jesus needed to withdraw from the crowds, so do we. And he has this final paragraph. People who work and minister without adequate restoration through prayer and meditation do not have the interior resources to manifest the fruit of the Spirit in a stress-filled world. During the quiet times of the devotional life, we gain the perspective and power we need to live with character and composure in the context of daily demands. So there has to be this rhythm in our life. We need to know what fills us. We probably in ministry don't have enough of this kind of thing, where we say, okay, I'm not the leader. I'm just going to sit back and see if maybe I can be, or we neglect the daily quiet time. I like this quote from Oswald Chambers. If I am devoted to the cause of humanity only, I will soon be exhausted and come to the place where my love will falter. But if I love Jesus Christ personally and passionately, I can serve humanity, though men may treat me as a doormat. There are going to be times when people in the church are the best people, but sometimes they can treat you like a doormat, and you can get discouraged. One of the reasons I stayed at Southeast Christian Church a long time was the elders there treated me really well. I mean, they treated me like a prima donna at times, and I developed this, I didn't get prideful that it was a big church, but I did get prideful, entitlement mentality almost, you know. I remember my 10th anniversary at church. I didn't say anything in the sermon about this, my 10th anniversary. I just preached, and at the end of the service, I said, let's all stand for the benediction. And the chairman of the elders came running forward and said, no, everybody be seated. This is Bob and Judy Russell's 10th anniversary with us. We'd like to acknowledge them and thank them for 10 years of service here. We'd like to give them a free week's vacation in St. Petersburg, Florida. Well, thank you very much. 15th anniversary, I said, let's all stand for the benediction. Chairman of the elders came running forward. No, everybody be seated. This is Bob and Judy's 15th anniversary here. We'd like to honor them free gift of a week's vacation in Estes Park, Colorado. Oh, thank you very much. 20th anniversary, I said, let's all stand for the benediction. Heavenly Father, we've been here 20 long years. I was crushed. Welcome to the real world. How many guys in the business world get even mentioned? How many in ministry? You served 10 years, 15, nothing said. But we get spoiled of pleasing people and approval by people, and sometimes they'll treat you like a doormat, a whole lot worse than that. And if you're going to stand there and stay there, you got to know not only what empties you, you got to know what fills you. What fills you so that you can withstand that pressure? Now, this is different. I'm going to share with you some things looking back on my ministry that enabled me to stay for 40 years. And maybe this will elicit some questions at the end. Number one, Remember your calling. Remember your calling. You are where you are in the church. You have a position of influence because God called you there. I don't think any of you sat down and looked at, here are 25 different occupations. Which one should I think I'll choose ministry. No, you're called. I had a session with about 250 preachers, and I said, how many of you had a dramatic call in the ministry? I guess 6 guys raised their hand. The majority of them, I said, how many of you feel called? Everybody raised their hand. It wasn't a miracle. They didn't hear an audible voice, but there were circumstances that occurred. Somebody encouraged them. They got nudged into him. And then they said, how'd I get here? And you look back and say, I'm here because God called me into ministry. And when you get discouraged, you remember that call. You remember why you're there, because the Lord called you. The Apostle Paul had a dramatic calling, struck down the road to Damascus. Now, when Saul of Tarsus got called, and he understood, and Ananias comes to him and says, God has made you a chosen vessel. Paul, who's pretty arrogant, Saul, who's arrogant, probably said, well, I know, call me into ministry. I'm going to go preach to the Jews. If anybody understands the Jews, I understand the Jews. Anybody can persuade the Jews, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. No, God's called you to be a chosen vessel to the Gentiles. The Gentiles. The uncircumcised. Well, if anybody could persuade Gentiles, I'm a whole lot smarter than they are. I guess I'll be able to win them by the thousand. No, he's called you to go to the Gentiles. He wants to show you how much you're going to what? Suffer for his name's sake. And Paul's ministry wasn't all that glamorous. I wonder if Paul ever got tired of the Christian people bragging about Simon Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost when 3,000 people got baptized. You never read that happening to Paul. We read, many scoffed at him, and some said, we'll hear about this later, and a few believed. And we read that Paul got thrown into prison, and he was shipwrecked, and he was stoned, and had all kinds. But when he stood before King Agrippa on trial for being an insurrectionist, what did Paul say? He said, I was not disobedient to that heavenly vision. And when we stand before God on Judgment Day, I doubt that Simon Peter is going to get more reward because he had 3,000 baptisms on the day of Pentecost, and Paul never had that. I think, Paul's going to hear the Lord say, well done. Yeah. You know, remember your calling. You're in ministry because God called you. The second thing I would say, and these are kind of random, I know, but here's what helped me stay in ministry. Develop a hobby that has nothing to do with the church. If you need to be devoted to the church and love the Lord, but if all you do is church, it will eventually drain you. You need a hobby that gets your mind off of it. I think we all need short-term goals and long-term goals and eternal goals. And when I get discouraged, I find out I need something to look forward to tomorrow or Friday. I'm going to go play golf. Early in my ministry, I played on a church softball team that was a competitive softball team. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, I played 83 softball games one summer. I performed 2 weddings with a softball uniform under my suit. They were short weddings too, because the game was right after the wedding and I didn't want to miss it. But I enjoed that a lot. I know you guys aren't going to understand, I enjoyed going to University of Louisville football games and basketball games and watching. It was short-term goals. And that was a hobby for me. And I would get my mind off church and onto something else. I think that's healthy. And I don't care if it's woodworking or it's fishing on Lake Barkley or boating or hiking. Or you need to have something. If you have something you do with your family or your wife, that's even better. I've got a friend in Louisville. He's a preacher. He likes to referee basketball games, big-time basketball games. He goes home at the end of the day, puts on his striped shirt, drives 30 miles out in the country where nobody knows him, and he referees these basketball games, and guys are yelling at him from the stands, calling him every name in the book. He said, it doesn't bother him. I've been to elders meetings, he said. You know? But that's his break. You need a hobby. Third thing I would say is develop the ability to say no. Or get someone to say no for you. I would guarantee almost all of you are in ministry because you are a people pleaser. You like to say yes to people. You like to serve people. And it's hard for you to say no. But let me tell you what, if you don't learn to say no, the ministry will eventually destroy you. It will consume you. Somebody said, if uncontrolled, work flows to the competent person until he submerges. And if people, you do a good job, you know what people say? Thank you, good job. And then you know what the next thing is? More work. Well, let me tell you from some experience. If you don't learn to say no, it'll burn you. I got burned a couple times forgetting appointments, and I had to learn to say no. And I wasn't very good at saying no, so I got somebody to say no for me. People say, I'll maybe talk about next session. I got a secretary who would say no. And people ask me, I'd love to do that, but would you contact my secretary? Jesus didn't say yes to everything. Mark 1:37 says, very early in the morning while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him. When they found him, they exclaimed, everybody's looking for you. Jesus replied, let's go someplace else, to the nearby villages so I can preach there also. That's why I've come. He didn't say yes to everybody. I heard about a preacher who confessed to his family that he'd been neglecting them. They said, on Monday, I'm going to take you all to the beach. We're going to spend all day on the beach. All the kids are all happy. They're all fired up. 7:30 in the morning, they're packing the car, and the preacher comes walking out to get in the car, and his phone rings, and there's a guy on the other end who's threatening to commit suicide. And the kids are saying, come on, Dad, come on, Dad. But the guy's threatening to commit suicide. And the preacher got a brilliant idea. He said to this guy, sir, can you wait until tomorrow? What? He said, well, you're threatening to commit suicide. Can you wait until tomorrow? Do it tomorrow. He said, if you wait until tomorrow, I'll come have breakfast with you and see if we can talk it through. Well, the guy thought that he could. And the preacher went on and had a great day with his family. And then he got up and preached a sermon on positive procrastination. I'm not sure that story's true, but it's too good to check out. There comes a time when you got to say to people, can you wait until tomorrow? I can't do it right now. Or can you check that out with somebody else? That you have to learn to say no. Fourth suggestion I would have is for those of you who preach, and may apply to those of you on staff, you'll have to adjust this. Take prolonged breaks away from the pulpit. I mentioned that the preachers used to preach Sunday morning, Sunday night. They used to teach Sunday school class, teach Wednesday night, and they did everything. But the quality of what they did suffered and wouldn't measure up today because they were being compared to the Methodist preacher down the street. Who do people compare you with today? The guy on TV, Matt Chandler, they get on the internet, or the Andy Stanley, or Rick Warren. They're hearing all these guys, and the standard for what they're expecting of you is pretty high. And it's a lot of pressure when you step into the pulpit. And it grinds you down if you're doing it too often. I went to our elders probably about halfway through my ministry. I said, guys, it looks to you like things are going pretty well, but I'm going to tell you what, I'm drained. I'm not saying I'm burned out, but I'm getting awful close. And they could have said, you're finding out what it's like to work more than one day a week, or whatever they would say. But they were very sympathetic, and they began to ask me how I spent my time. And finally they said, well, why don't you get other people to preach on Sunday night? Why don't you go to the hospital? Finally I said, I think I need a sabbatical. They said, how long would you like to be gone? I said, I'd like to be gone about 4 months. He said, we're in a building program and you want to be gone 4 months? That's crazy. So they began to hash it back and forth. And one of the elders said, hey, Bob, you take 3 weeks of vacation every summer. Why don't you add 2 weeks onto that as a study break? And why don't you take 5 Sundays off in the summer and see if that doesn't satisfy you every summer? Well, I did, and I'm telling you what, that was the salvation of my ministry. Sometimes, and I'm in a good situation. I don't know how you guys do it, this constant pressure, but sometimes I would take the whole month of July off, and sometimes I would get in May, I'd say if I can just hang on by my fingertips until July, I can get a break. And sometimes I would leave in July and think, I don't care if I ever come back. And the first week, I would do nothing. We had a guy in the church who let us use his cabin in Smoky Mountains, and I would do nothing but spend time with my boys and my family. And to this day, my sons will take their kids down to Gatlinburg, and they say, this is a cabin we stayed in. Here's where I learned to swim. Here's where I learned to fish. Here's where my dad taught me how to play golf. Best time of our lives when they had total focus of Bob Russell, who wasn't preparing for a sermon. Second week, about the end of the second week, I'd go to a Christian bookstore in Knoxville, and I'd buy $200 worth of books, and then I'd come back and start studying. Third week, I'd start writing on my sermon. Fourth week, I'd get the sermon finished. Fifth, I'm chomping at the bit to come back. And when I come back, it's like a revival when I come back after 5 weeks. They're tired of hearing youth minister preach. They want to hear some real preaching. And And it was good for the church to be remembered. Hey, this isn't about the preacher, it's about Jesus Christ. And it's healthy for them. And now, most of you are not in a position where you can go to your elder and say, I'd like to take 5 weeks off for the summer. But you can make adjustments. One of the things, I'll tell you what you guys do on vacation. You take 10 days off, 1 Sunday off, and you take this little thing, and you take your computer, and you run the church from a distance. You try to squeeze in a trip to the amusement park and the beach with your kids, and you come home more exhausted when you left. I'm just telling you, I think there needs to be this rhythm. Jesus' ministry only lasted 3.5 years. He spent the first 40 days off by himself. And there needs to be this renewal, this refreshing of spirit that takes place. One of the things I did, Wayne Smith, who used to preach at Southland and Lexington, Wayne Smith and I would exchange pulpits once a year. That was a week I didn't have to write a sermon. It was a great week. They loved Wayne Smith. I went to Southland, and we just used sermons that we'd used the week before. But there needs to be didn't cost anybody anything. There needs to be some way that you get out of the pulpit. Let me do one other thing and then we'll quit. Keep your eye on the ultimate goal. The Bible talks about set your affections on the things above, not on earthly things. And remember that you're not in it for man's approval. You're in it for God's approval. At Christmas, and I'll stop and see if there are questions in a second. Let me tell this story. I got an email middle of December from a family. I barely recognized the name, but they said, Bob, we'd like to invite you to come to our house for a Christmas brunch. Didn't give me much detail, but for some reason I said to my wife, you know, we're free that morning. I remember that name. Let's go to that brunch. I walk up, nice house in Plainview, ring the doorbell. The owner of the house meets me, introduces me to his wife, and said, we got 4 kids running around here. He introduced me to his sister and her husband, and his other sister and her husband, and 19 kids running around this house, all dressed up. I could tell this is an annual event for them, big family reunion. I look around, there are no other guests here. I wonder, why are we here? Finally, they said, okay, time to eat. Everybody come in the family room. Now, before we eat, Bob and Judy, you're probably wondering why you're here. We want you to sit down here in the center of the room. We want to take just a moment to tell you about the difference that Jesus Christ has made in our life and to thank you for preaching the gospel years ago when we first came to church. My name is Diane, I don't remember her last name. I was a teenager and my parents were going through a terrible divorce years ago. And an older woman invited me to come to church because she knew how I was struggling. I came to church and I heard the gospel and I gave my life to Christ. When I was baptized, it was like a 10-ton load lifted off of me. And I went on to study to serve God, and I met my husband, David, and he's a preacher in southern Indiana. We just got back from a mission field, and we have these 7 kids and 1 more on the way. And we want to thank you for preaching the gospel. It changed our life. And then the other sister said, my name is Carolyn. I was at the University of Kentucky when my younger sister first started coming to church, and I was living a duplicitous life, and I came to church at her invitation. She told me what the first sermon she heard was about, and she said, I was convicted. I gave my life to Christ, and this my husband, Mark, and we've spent the last 6 years translating the Bible for Bible translators in Papua New Guinea, and these are our 4 kids and 1 more on the way. And the husbands of the host of where we met said, my name is Michael Martis. I am the Dean of Students at the University of Louisville. This is my godly wife, Ani. We have 4 kids we homeschool. I'm trying to take the gospel into a dark place, be the light of Jesus Christ there. And my sisters invited me to come, and I just want to thank you for telling us about Jesus Christ. Then one by one, the kids who were old enough got up and said, my name is Andrew, I was baptized on. My name is Elizabeth, I was baptized on. My name is Mary, I was baptized on. The last one said, my name is John, and I am a student at Boyce Bible College. I'm studying to be a preacher. And then they passed out a little song sheet, and everybody, all in the family, they all sang, to God be the glory, great things he had done. I could not stop tears, because that was the theme song that we sang every Sunday when they first started coming to church. And I got to the car and I said, Judy, somebody listen. Let me tell you, you do not know the long-term effect of the gospel that you preached. That seed will not return empty. You may not see it in your lifetime. There may never be anybody invite you to come to a brunch and say thank you. But I'll tell you what, when you stand up in heaven, the Lord will thank you, and you're going to have people in line saying, thank you for introducing me to the Lord. So keep your eyes on eternity and not on this world. Okay, I'm going to stop there, see if you got questions, and we'll take a break.